Hello, welcome to the Fort Wayne Museum of Art Curators Tour. I was just enjoying this painting by Charles Hawthorne called The Widow. It's kind of apropos to the show we're going to tour today. This is a different show, American Impressionism. It's a great show also. Before we enter our show for today, it's all centered around Life magazine. And for those of you who are not really familiar with Life magazine, it dates back to 1936. And I wanted to tell you what the publisher had in mind when he created this magazine. It was Henry Robertson Luce who created it. He created Time magazine, Life magazine, Fortune magazine, and Sports Illustrated. You may have heard of those. Okay, his vision was to see life, to see the world, to eyewitness great events, to watch the faces of the poor and the gestures of the proud, to see things, machines, armies, multitudes, shadows in the jungle and on the moon, to see man's work, his paintings, towers, discoveries, to see things thousands of miles away, things hidden behind walls and within rooms, things dangerous to come to, the women that men love and the many children, to see and take pleasure in seeing, to see and be amazed, to see and be instructed. I think he hit that when he hired Larry Burrows. Larry Burrows was an Englishman born in London. He worked for Life magazine starting during World War II, in fact. He was an assistant and worked as a technician. Later in the 50s, he worked in Europe, reproducing and becoming an expert in color photography, reproducing the old masters in some of the museums. So let's take a walk into the exhibit today. As we all know, words mean things. When people hear the word Vietnam, a lot of emotions can get stirred up. This exhibit is called Larry Burrows, Life in Vietnam. As we just discovered, Larry Burrows was a photographer for Life magazine. His major body of work, starting in 1962, was photographing the disruption and the war in Vietnam. When we enter here, the thing that we start with is a mannequin of a Marine in his combat uniform. When we first started talking about the show, Charles Shepard and I, the director of the museum, we wanted to present photographs of the Vietnam War, but we also wanted to present artifacts of the Vietnam War. So we finally came up with the show of using Life magazines and partnering with the Museum of the Soldier in Portland, Indiana, to draw artifacts from, so that there would be three-dimensional representations of some of the two-dimensional photographs. And I think it came out fairly well. I think I need to apologize if I forgot to actually introduce who I am. I'm Brian Williamson. I'm the technical director here at the Fort Wayne Museum of Art. And I usually do not curate shows for the museum. I usually just install them. But my particular passion is military history. I spent 31 years in the Indiana Army National Guard, and I did a tour in Afghanistan. I'm also founding board member of the Museum of the Soldier in Portland, Indiana, and an amateur military historian. That's why I was a good fit to curate this show. So once again, welcome to Larry Burrows, Life in Vietnam. As we mentioned, we have our mannequin here. This is from one of the Life magazines from I believe 1966, the October 26th issue. And we have this photograph of Wilson, let me get his name, Marine Private First Class Philip Wilson. He's fording this stream here, and you can see he's all geared up. He's got this big bazooka, a 3.5-inch M20 bazooka. He's got his rocket launcher. He's got his flak jacket on. And he's literally on patrol in combat in Vietnam. That's one of the things that Larry did. He went out with the soldiers in the field. He did not file reports from Saigon, and He was out in the field with the troops. So we've got Wilson here in this mannequin. Obviously he's not in the stream anymore. He's out of the stream. He's got his bazooka and his rocket launcher. One of the things that we find out as we read our story about Wilson and this particular photograph. Here's a press release. The Department of Defense announced Wednesday that Private First Class Philip M. Wilson of Wolford, Texas, was killed in action in connection with the Vietnam War. Wilson was killed about a week after this photograph was taken. As we move along through the show, we see that we have enlargements of some of the photographs that Larry made, and we've actually framed some of the magazines from that era. This is Larry Burrows' first Life magazine cover from 1963. What's happening here, we see South Vietnamese troops have some prisoners, which would be Viet Cong or communist soldiers, and obviously they're in for a bad time. War makes people, breaks things, and I believe these folks are going to be broken.
But it's a very special cover because of
that's. Thank you, Caitlin. This is a special cover, as she mentioned. It's actually a double fold-out. Normal magazine, Life magazine, is this size here. This photo was so powerful to the editors that they enlarged it so that it would be a fold-out cover, so you could get a lot more impact on that.
You can see the fold line right here.
And as we curated this show, we wanted to show not just the war part. We wanted to show, well, we've got a politician here. We got the Ambassador Lodge coming out of the American Embassy. We've got Special Forces troops here, and this is a pretty dramatic photo of Captain Vernon Gillespie, who, you see they're burning this village here. And while that looks like, oh, that's a terrible thing, well, that's the Viet Cong village. That's where the BC were hiding. So that's why it had to go up in flames. Here's a close-up of Gillespie here.
Sorry for the reflections.
We also have some lighthearted moments. We see a Special Forces soldier sharing a cigarette with a mountain guard, and you can see this guy's been around a while. He's quite enjoying his cigarette. Burrows was a very good technician, and he had a wonderful eye for composition. This is a really, really neat photograph here of a watchtower outside a village. This next photo, we have an early picture also, 1964. That's an American advisor leading a Viet Cong patrol. That particular soldier was first went into the military during World War II and made a career out of being a Special Forces, and he was one of the first 100 advisors into Vietnam. In this photo we see a Catholic Mass going on, and you see the priest, he's wearing a camouflage frock. It's really interesting, made out of a parachute. And here we see some of the more ugly aspects of the war, the mud and the blood. Here we see one of the most ubiquitous things of the Vietnam War, I guess you could say, was the Huey helicopter. That sound is probably embedded in most soldiers' hearing. Here we see another shot from a Huey. We see the gunner looking along the Mekong River there. Here's a shot of when Larry went with some of the Navy patrol boats See the sailor with his 50 caliber machine gun as another patrol boat sweeps in behind. The rivers were one of the main ways to transport, whether it be the U.S. Navy or the Vietnamese sampans, and it was always a struggle to control the traffic on the rivers because the Viet Cong would use them also. Here we have some Cambodians that were being moved from one place to another to get them away from some of the combat. What's interesting about this photo is that particular ship was an American-made ship, an LST from World War II, and it was actually made in Evansville, Indiana. And at this time it had been transferred to the Taiwanese Navy, and we apparently were paying the Taiwan Navy to move these civilians to get them out of harm's way. We have a tender photo of a man probably with his child, and they were some of the refugees of the war. Some of the artifacts that we brought from the Museum of the Soldier is this grouping of things from Butch Gibson. His family called him Butch. When he joined the military, his buddies in the Army called him Gibb because of his last name. He grew up in Pennville, Indiana, just south of Fort Wayne, a few miles, and ended up joining the Army in about 1962. He took to it really well, and he started going into some of the really heavy, physically and mentally demanding courses. He became a paratrooper, and he ended up going through the Ranger course, which was very tough to do, and ended up in the Special Forces. And the Special Forces, as most people know, are the Green Berets also. The main thing was the Green Berets. And one of the neatest artifacts we have, and you can see it right now, is his beret that he wore, and it obviously is a Green Beret. And this one in particular has got a special insignia on it. The 5th Special Forces from Vietnam has the colors of Vietnamese flag, and it also has the Special Forces crest. Now, Butch was an interesting guy. He did all of these heavy-duty schools. Then he ended up taking a year-long course in Special Forces medic course. So he was a very highly trained soldier, became a very excellent Special Forces soldier, and was deployed to Vietnam. Unfortunately, he did lose his life in Vietnam. It was then a firefight where he was trying to protect some of his troops, and he was trying to knock out the enemy troops as he was approaching, and they got him first. But he was a good trooper. Over here we have one of the more interesting photo stories that Larry did of the Yankee Papa 13. Was a Marine helicopter squadron that were ferrying some South Vietnamese troops into a zone, and it turned out to be a hot landing zone. And this was still fairly early in the war. It was 1965. There were not a lot of American troops in the country at that time. And Larry had been riding with this particular helicopter squadron for a while. And in fact, he had rigged up a special device on the machine gun of this particular gunner. And you can barely see it in this here. This little device here attached to the bipod of the machine gun actually has another camera on it. Larry was a technician beyond par with his cameras. He not only knew them inside and out, he knew how to operate them remotely and things like that, so he could get some of these more dramatic pictures. In this particular episode, he's following James Farley. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Yeah, James Farley. He's one of the Marine helicopter squadron. Here he is. He's in town shopping, and he's kind of mugging for the shop owner there with one of the hats. What's interesting about this particular flight, let me go grab a book. This you can see, but the photo story centers on James Farley, and so we've got photos of him prepping the helicopter. He was the crew chief, so he was responsible for going over the helicopter before every mission to make sure everything was in tip-top shape. Of course, the pilots were also responsible too, but he was the main enlisted man in response, so he has to check everything out. And he's also one of the gunners on the aircraft. So here you see him bringing the guns to the helicopter, and this is that special bracket I was talking about. The camera is not attached to it at this moment, but Larry will be attaching to it shortly. So we're getting ready for this mission. They're loading the South Vietnamese troops into the helicopter so they can take them to this landing zone. And as the mission progresses, here's one of the pictures that Larry took from that bracket on the helicopter. Because if you just looked at this, you think, how in the world did he get that picture? That helicopter's flying. Well, that's how he did it. He added that special bracket on the machine gun. So here we see him discoursing the South Vietnamese troops into this landing zone, and other helicopters from the squadron are doing the same thing, dropping their troops off. Here's another one of those pictures that he's taken with the remote camera. Now, what we see in this action is this particular helicopter has been disabled. It's no longer operable, and this is the pilot, or the pilot of this helicopter. We see the co-pilot is still in the helicopter. He's coming to Larry's helicopter to pick him up, and the commander of the helicopter that Farley and Burrows was in asked Farley to see if he could go get the other pilot out of the helicopter. So he literally jumps out of the helicopter to run over here, and literally bullets are flying all over this landing zone. I'll come back to this picture in a second. So Farley jumps out to go over to see if he could get that pilot. Burrows jumps out of the helicopter also and runs and taking pictures of Farley as he's climbing up into this helicopter to try to get that other pilot out. When Farley gets up there, he sees that the pilot's been shot in the neck, and you can imagine what you see there. And he couldn't get him out. Even to recover the body, he wasn't able to physically do it. There's bullets impacting all the way around and everything, and so he runs back to the helicopter. Okay.
Burrows following.
Burrows following, exactly. So now we see this picture, which is the magazine cover. We have two helicopter crewmen wounded on the floor. This is one of the gunners that got into the helicopter before we did. This is the first time we see him in a picture. This is the pilot that we see right here. Right now, you see him, he's not wounded. We saw him here. He's not wounded yet. He gets hit literally as he's getting into this helicopter. He's shot in under the armpit where the body armor doesn't protect him. And unfortunately, he dies. Now, another thing that's interesting, we go back here, he couldn't get this pilot out. Okay, he was unsuccessful to retrieve him. Well, another helicopter landed a few moments later, and two guys went out and was able to get this man out. He was still alive, but he had been shot and he was paralyzed basically. He was from Columbus, Indiana. It's a very dramatic story, and it's the kind of work that Burrows was known for. After that mission was over, we see Farley, he's kind of very emotional at this point, and he's having kind of a moment. And one of the things that Burrows was very sensitive about was this. So let's read this real quick. Larry had an extraordinary sense of delicacy, A war photographer is by definition a recorder of suffering of others. And Larry used to worry about that. He said, it's not easy to take a shot of a man crying as though you have no thoughts, no feelings as to his suffering. He took such pictures again and again because to him they were the ones that showed the truth of the war. Yet there were occasions when he would turn away from a scene of human grief out of his concern that his presence would aggravate the feelings of those involved. That was written by one of Larry's Life magazine handlers. We've got our mannequin here that is dressed like Farley was on that mission. And this actually, for military history collectors, this is a very rare camouflage flight suit from the early Vietnam era. And it was actually made in Japan. And it's a really neat story about these. They're custom made. They're not actually military issue, this particular one. And they were kind of proud of those. I forgot to mention that if somebody has a question, you can send that along. And then I'll try to answer them while we do this live. We covered some of the ground war. Now we've got some of the air war. Larry tried to cover all aspects of the Vietnam War. Like we mentioned, we saw him with the Marines crossing that stream when he was flying with his helicopter squadron. He also flew with missions with the Air Force. And he was actually able to more or less con his way into some of the aircraft on different missions, depending on what kind of aircraft they were. And so we see one that he literally was flying back seat in these aircraft as they're flying on a mission in dawn. Then we have a nice close-up of one of the pilots that was flying one of the aircraft. And this particular man was at the time this picture was taken, he was 42 years old. He graduated from West Point in 1946. See that this Sky Raider just dropped a phosphorus bomb here. Well, that's horrifyingly beautiful, I think, is one of the things I said about that. Now, one of the things that a lot of, say, war movies never get into is behind the scenes type of things like this picture shows us here. This is an Air Force plotting board where this is where the missions were planned and tracked, and it keeps track of the weather and where the planes are and all kinds of things that I have no understanding of because I'm Army, I wasn't Air Force. But it's one of the things that Larry did, that he went and tried to show all aspects of the conflict. So here we got Larry back in the airplane again, and we can see that some of these planes are dropping napalm there. And here we are again in the aircraft, and this is once again when Larry actually had the Air Force pilots take, or probably technicians, take the doors off of one of these C-47s so that he could get a better picture of these Gatling guns firing their weapons. This is one of the famous aircraft that came out of the Vietnam War. The Huff the Magic Dragon is what some people call them. They were the specially armed C-47s that had GE Gatling guns in them. And they could fire 18,000 rounds of 7.62 millimeter ammunition a minute. 18,000 rounds of bullets. That's a lot of firepower. Here we have a helicopter with delivering some ammunition, and we see the artillery piece there in the foreground and the battalion guidon flapping in the downdraft from the helicopter. And this guidon still exists. It's at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. That very one that's in that picture. Now here's a neat picture that is typical of Vietnam. We see the Huey helicopter, we see the F-16 rifles, and if you can look real close here, we see this trooper jumping off there. He's got something in his helmet. That would be an Ace of Spades bicycle playing card. Why is he doing that? Well, there was a rumor that the Vietnamese people were scared of the playing card design, the ace of spades, like a death card, and so Americans started using them as a psychological warfare piece. And it was investigated and turned out that there was no basis that they were scared or superstitious of this particular card for any reason, but it was a psychological thing that made the Americans feel good. So it was just something that became a thing for them to do as a death card to leave on dead Vietnamese. In fact, so much so that the U.S. Playing Card Company out of Cincinnati, Ohio, sent entire decks of Ace of Spades playing cards. So that's what you're seeing here. This whole deck was all Ace of Spades, and it was called Secret Weapon. That's the ubiquitous M1 combat helmet with the camouflage cover, and they became, with the camouflage band, an easy place to tuck things, to keep them, have them handy but out of the way. You keep your cigarettes or your matches or your gun oil, and the helmet covers themselves became kind of a canvas for soldiers to write opinions. This particular one doesn't have anything on it, but on our Marine up there, he had written Wilson Rockets on it because he was in charge of the rocket launchers. Along this wall, we have some of the suffering and the cost of war. We see a widow, like we mentioned earlier, who's actually has just been presented. Well, her husband had been killed weeks earlier in a massacre, and this is his body, and they're just getting ready to move it from the grave site to be properly buried because it was in a mass grave that the VC had dug and put him in. Another interesting story that really touched Larry was this little girl who lived in a village, very, very poor family, and of course, when you're living in a village in a war zone, bad things can happen. And as it turned out, she was caught in a friendly fire incident where an American helicopter saw them moving in an area where they weren't supposed to be, and they fired on her, and she lost her leg. The machine gun took her leg off. And Larry saw her at a hospital, and he did a story on her, and he did follow-up stories later. And so he followed her around when she had her prosthetic leg being made, and it's really a really touching story. And one of the things that most people don't know is Larry was married and had a couple kids. He had a daughter about the same age as this little girl, and so she really touched his heart. So much so that he actually ended up buying her a sewing machine. And because at one point she said that she wanted to be a seamstress when she got older. In 2017, another reporter went back to Vietnam and found this lady, and of course she still remembered her friend Larry, and she still had that sewing machine. It no longer worked because it had worn out, but she fondly remembered her friend Larry that helped her all that time. This is a similar type story about another Vietnamese that was wounded during the war, and he was actually sent to the United States for surgeries to heal him, and it was one of those deals where trying to help some of the things that you broke. What we've got here is a grouping of medals and things from Private Lawrence Tuttle, who was Fort Wayne, Indiana. He was 20 years old when he went to Vietnam. He was an infantryman. He arrived in Vietnam January 9, 1968. January 31, 1968. He was in with his troops They were attacked, mortar rounds flying around. He was grievously injured during that attack, and he died a few days later. I'm not sure that I mentioned this yet. Larry Burrows did not survive the Vietnam War. In 1971, he was on yet another photographic mission. He was flying in a South Vietnamese helicopter with South Vietnamese troops that were being taken into Laos. And he was in a helicopter with 4 other journalists, 4 photographers, and the helicopter was shot down in 1971. While they were pretty sure that he was dead, everybody was on the aircraft would have perished. They were in enemy territory, and that particular aircraft was not explored until many, many years after the war was over. And because there were no Americans on it, the American MIA commissions, that was not on their radar to look at that crash site. But a number of years later, they did explore that crash site and found some human remains, found the remains of one of Larry's cameras, found film, and it definitely confirmed that there were no survivors from that helicopter, and so that he finally was laid to rest as one of the ones that finally was recovered. One of the things that one of Larry's bosses said after his helicopter became missing, and he was presumed dead at that point, he said, this was from John Czar, the Life's Far East Bureau Chief, the depth of his commitment and concentration was frightening. He could have been a surgeon or a soldier or almost anything else, but he chose photography and was so dedicated that he saw the world in 35mm exposures. Work was his life, eventually his death. And Burrows, I think, wouldn't have bitched. Well, I thank you for visiting with us today. We really enjoy presenting shows that are varied, that are exciting, and every few weeks we have a new show, so please come in and visit. Be safe and have a good day.